dive in, because one thing I want to talk about today is I want to talk about these people. I want to talk about you. I want to talk about the people in London, people in ULO, and what unites us here at MoneySuperMarket, I think. So, like I said, these people here, you guys here, and as I mentioned earlier, in my opinion, we're all designing. All of us, I consider to be designers, even compliance, especially compliance. And I'll get to the reason behind that later in the talk. But essentially, everyone is a designer. And whether you know you are, or you don't think you are, or you're designing consciously or subconsciously, whenever we're interacting and sort of making decisions around our products, we're designing that experience for our users. So, in my mind, everyone's a designer. And there's some obvious designers. So, the people that are most obvious are those that have the title as a designer. And then we have our writers who are creating wonderful copy, and we have our researchers. We all kind of think of those as sort of designing the products. There's the less obvious designers, so our developers, our people in marketing and product and data. They're definitely designers. All decisions they do impact how our product ends up looking and how our users feel about it and how they interact with it. And then there's the less obvious. So again, compliance, legal, some of the back-end stuff, our friends in commercial and SaaS and the people team. Again, these people are definitely designers. They have an influence and having an impact on the overall product. And again, how our users interact with that. So decisions they make, they're really, really important. So like I said, yeah, you're a designer, your decisions matter, they affect the user's experience in the end. So thank you for doing that. And this is even being mentioned by UX Megamind, Jared Spall, who made a very controversial statement that, again, everyone who influences how product looks and feels is a designer. So our PMs, people in compliance, our developers, they're all designers. But Twitter being the place where constructive conversation happens, and designers being the sort of level-headed, emotionally stable people they are, definitely took that statement really, really well. So Jared went back and he sort of thought about what he was saying, and was saying, right, everyone is definitely a designer. Design is something that you can learn. So how do we go about being better designers? So first part of my talk was really sort of trying to get everyone to think and recognise that whatever they do, they are designing the product. Their decisions matter. Second part is I want to talk about how you go from being a great designer, a good designer, so now that you know you're a designer, how do you go from being a good designer to a great designer? Luckily, there's a really good talk on YouTube about it. So earlier this year I did a talk about the principles of visual design. So if you want to go and watch that and start to get like a bit of a learn on it, that's great. But one thing I recognised about that video, it was a lot about design doing. So people aren't going to go away from this talk, or from that talk, sorry, download Sketch and start pushing pixels. That's not going to happen. So in this talk, I wanted to talk less about design doing and more about design thinking, how we can think more like a designer and make, and it's kind of touching on a lot of things that people have spoken about today, like Lizzie, like how do you make the decisions that make you a better designer. So my first point in being how to think more like a designer is to be specific. If we're going to think like a designer, we also need to talk like a designer. And by that I don't mean so much the sort of terminology and the jargon that we use. It's more about how you articulate your feelings around design. So hands up, who's heard this before? Yeah, so most designers here have definitely heard this. And hands up if you got really, really frustrated by hearing this. Yeah, exactly the same people. And that's because it's really vague feedback. It can be really frustrating because the person who's saying this to you, it's clear they've not taken the time to consider how that design makes them feel, whether they like it or dislike it. Because when you see a piece of design, it's really easy to straight away just go, I like that, I don't like that. It's a little bit more difficult to say why you don't like that. So we try and sort of stay away from things like this as designers and try and do something a little bit more like this, where we're sort of taking the time to think about our feelings. And as designers, we love to think about our feelings because we're an emotional bunch. This is better because it's specific, it's actionable, and we as designers, or the makers of designs, know that by taking time to articulate your feelings, that you're showing interest in it. That makes it much more collaborative, and we can iterate on that much, much faster. So, be specific, talk like a designer. Secondly, be curious and to play the role of a newbie. We've often talked about the beginner's mindset and why that's a benefit. As a beginner, you have no preconceived notions, you are free of judgment. But as a beginner, that somewhat implies you're a novice and that you're just starting out. In fact, a lot of us here, we work here because we're highly skilled at what we do, we have experience and we have expertise. So I'm talking more about the role of a newbie. As a newbie, as someone who's new to the company, you've been hired because you have expertise, you have that experience. But you also have the benefits, some luxuries and benefits of being someone new. So the newbie, because they're new, they want to learn, they're inquisitive. Because they're new, they're afforded certain leniencies, so they can be a bit more bold in how they present their ideas. As a newbie, you can come up with something that maybe they've tried before, and someone will say to you, right, we've done that, it doesn't work. And you can say, because you're a newbie, because you're non-threatening, and because primarily you're on probation, you can't be that sort of pushy about it. You can say, well, why didn't that work? What have we learned since? So be a newbie. Ask questions, challenge assumptions. And again, because you're on probation, you can't be too threatening about that. You can't be too pushy. But a newbie, they want to listen, they want that clarity. And because they're new, what they want to do is learn. That's their sole agenda. So be curious, be a newbie. We've talked about our users lots today, and as a company that wants to sort of strive to help households save money each year, they become the centre of everything we do. So to do that, we have to understand our users. So we always think about our users first. We're putting ourselves in their point of view constantly. And because of that, we're constantly asking those questions, why are we doing what we're doing? We're here to solve problems for our users. What problems are we solving and who are we solving it for? It's easy to think that our users are just our customers. But for many people in the business, our people team, service desk, our customers aren't their users. They're, for our people in commercial, they're our providers and partners. For our teams who manage the back office systems, they're our internal people, and they're also our candidates and people that want to work here. So how can we understand our users and how can we frame our questions, our problem solving around them? It's easy to forget that you're not the user, well, not you alone anyway. All of our decisions should be based on our actual users and not just our own opinion. And that's why we like to watch our users and learn from them. And that's an essential part of being a designer. And why I encourage everyone to watch our users and learn from their behaviour as much as possible. I'm really lucky working on the McQueen team, who are always really involved in our qual sessions, packing out the room to see how the users are interacting with the things that they're building and they're delivering. So there's always plenty of notes and plenty of insights around the user's behaviour. But there's also the on-site stuff, like user biller and the analytics that tell us what our users are doing on our site. So there's so many opportunities to learn about our users and their behaviour. And that becomes a vital part of designers' mindset, is to have that empathetic point of view and to think, well, what do our users think of this? Next point is to think like a designer, you have to be asking the right questions and have that open mind. So how do you ask the right questions? Because ultimately the questions we ask will lead us to our solutions. So if we're asking the wrong questions, we're going to end up with the wrong solutions. When we start off with thinking about problems, we're always told you need to think outside the box, you need these big, bold ideas. To me, that way of thinking is just completely wrong. As a designer, we need focus and we need direction to be able to solve the right problems. I think there's a misconception that designers want this creative freedom just to go away and just do whatever they want. And me personally, that's wrong. I love to have direction and I love to understand what I'm working with so I can ask those right questions. And that's where sort of like our friends in sort of legal and compliance come in. They tell us, we can't do this, we can do this. Those are the constraints that we need to really love, because they allow us to frame our questions in the right way. So we're ready to explore all the possible solutions that they open up. There's also a right way and a wrong way of answering questions, to be honest. We don't want to be asking questions like this, which in my opinion can lead to very binary answers and very narrow focus. If we're asking questions like this that ultimately result in a yes or no answer, then I think it's a sign that we haven't really looked deep enough into the problem. Instead, we want to use maybe a technique like how might we, a sort of a common problem technique that UXers use to really open up this question and get back to these ambiguous questions. Because in this sort of situation, ambiguity is good. It leads to a lot of different interpretations, which then leads to lots and lots of ideas. And by answering those questions, we can like really dive deep into the problem that we're trying to solve. So, to think like a designer, you need to be really open-minded. Lastly, as a designers, we want to be methodical and follow a process to help us get to those answers that we're looking for. Because design ultimately is a process. We start at one end, where we have our challenge, our problem that we're trying to solve, and eventually we'll end up with an outcome. And that process is going to be your best friend. It gives you a sort of a way to solve that problem that you can replicate for every problem. And you might use one process to solve one problem, and you might use one process to solve another problem, but ultimately it's giving that framework to approach the problem and make sure you've thought of every point. As part of this talk, you'll probably notice that at some points I'm talking about being very, very specific and very, very narrow, and at other points I'm talking about being very general and very broad and opening things up. And that's very deliberate because that's part of the process. We like to use something called the double diamond, which was developed by the Design Council of the UK. And again, you can see here where we start talking about things getting very, very broad and open and things getting very, very narrow. At one end, we have our challenge, like I spoke about a minute ago. And at that point, we're in a very much a discovery mindset. And there, we just want to open everything way up and get as much insight as possible. That when we come to define that problem, we get very, very specific. And we have our problem because we've opened it up and we've explored the opportunities. We've looked at what users are doing on our site and we find out where the problems are. And then in the middle we have our problem. We've defined our problem, and then we can open it up again really, really wide and get as many ideas as possible coming through. Once we've settled on a few of those ideas, we can then again get really specific and start to narrow them down into one or two very specific ideas that we then want to test. At that point, we're taking it to users, we're getting their input, we're validating those ideas. And if we're not getting the answers we want, we then loop straight back round to another point in the process and take it back. Maybe it's a discovery, maybe it's a defined part of the process. And again, we start getting more specific again, and we sort of approach other ideas, and we take those learnings and we keep iterating on it. So that's our process. We want to be very methodical, and we don't want to sort of, again, there's a misconception that designers just go everywhere. But we want to follow a step-by-step process to try and get those really good, juicy solutions that could solve the problem that we're talking about. So again, these people, they're all designers. You here, all designers. Design is your superpower. Now that you're conscious of it, that how much of an influence you have on the user experience, that it's not just me, it's not just the UX designers either, that you're all an integral part of designing the user experience. You can then take that away and think to yourself, well actually, what can I do to be a better designer? And hopefully, those 5 steps I've given you will help you develop your design thinking. I just want to end on a quote here from Tim Brown, who's the founder of IDEO, a company that's well known for its innovation and development of the design thinking framework. So again, this could apply to your work here at MSM and MSc, but it also applies to what you're doing every day, personal and professional, that you are a designer, you're creating these experiences. So, wonderful. Thank you very much for your time.